much, David, and Happy New Year to everybody. So I'm coming from Rennes too, as you can see. And the topic today will be on late industrialization. So I will speak mainly about manufacturing sector. I will precise it again, but don't mismatch. It's only about the manufacturing sector. Starting by a retrospective view on the manufacturing, fast one, because I'm sure you know already the major role of manufacturing development in growth and catching up. And then I will move to a second part, which is more, it's more relevant with the title about Subsaharan Africa and the potential or the possibility of more industrialization in this area. Okay. So I start by declining the question. Well, first about the wider issue on late industrialization for developing countries now in Africa or elsewhere, which has been a little bit discussed recently by a number of papers. It started in the mid-2000s, and there has been a set of papers about the limits or the new condition of late industrialization in developing countries. Just I start by recalling you this point that you know already, I'm sure, that no countries has become rich so far without having a stage of manufacturing expansion in terms of output, in terms of employment. There have been only a very small number of exceptions, such as financial havens or oil-producing countries, but in terms of world population, it's almost nothing. All other countries had started to develop their economy by increasing the size of their manufacturing sectors. It was the case in the 19th century. It was the case in the early 20th century with Japan, in the late 20th century, and still in the early 21st century with a major example, which is China. And as a matter of fact, there has always been since 200 years a quite strong correlation between the manufacturing value added per head in a country and the GDP per capita in a country, except, as I said, for a small, very small share of the world population. So far, there has been no development without industrialization. There has been no other way, there has been no alternative. Why is manufacturing so important? Why the role of the manufacturing sector is so heavy in the development process? There has been a number of papers already and studies that explain that at the macro level through empirical studies, through using also historical survey. Well, the best explanation is probably from Kaldor, with the Kaldor's law that shows that in fact the growth of the manufacturing sector in a country, even when this manufacturing sector is small or at the beginning, if the growth rate of this sector is enough strong dynamic, it will lead to productivity improvement in the manufacturing sector, but also in the other sectors of the economy. So this is the major development power of the manufacturing sector. And the second, one of the other strong advantage, probably the second one, is the ability or the capacity of the manufacturing sector to absorb large volume of low qualified workers coming from the countryside without any specific qualification. And so far, there has been no alternative in terms of employment expansion at such a fast rate. So this is a historical background so far. But, and the conclusion still is no other way for development than through manufacturing, through the development of the manufacturing sector. Even if after a certain stage, there could be, of course, a deindustrialization and moving to high productivity services, but the manufacturing stage has been unavoidable so far. This view, or this result, or this consensus, has been challenged by several papers. One of the most famous, as in it is frequent, was from Roderick, Daniel Roderick, who published a paper in 2016 on premature deindustrialization. But in fact, as in other of his papers, the major inspiration came from other researchers, Dasgupta and Singh especially. Anyhow, it is a paper which is very influent, which has led to a number of comments, quotation, and so on. And what Roderick showed in this paper is that, in fact, since the 90s, roughly, in developing countries, the peak of industrialization, so the ratio of manufacturing value added on GDP, or the share of the manufacturing value added on GDP, this peak has been much lower, so since the last 20 or 30 years, than before. Meaning that, in fact, the potential for industrialization has narrowed, has reduced. It's much smaller than before. And he proposed a number of econometric results which show roughly division by 2, or a peak 2 times lower than before in terms of manufacturing expansion. So the consequence is that, in fact, manufacturing could not probably lead anymore to a long and sustainable process of economic development, increase of income level, and so on. This is the major conclusion. I don't know whether you have heard about this paper or the thesis on premature deindustrialization. Yes, no? Okay. So I move to the critique we can make to this paper, and after that I will confront the argument with the real trend, the real statistic trend about manufacturing activity in developing countries. But first of all, 3 critiques about the paper, the Roderick papers. First, the sample he used is very narrow. The number of developing countries is less than 30. And he precised in the paper that, in fact, so you have roughly 6 or 7 African countries, 8 or 9 South or Latin American countries, and so on. And he precised in the paper that, in fact, the trends are relevant except for Asian countries and manufacturing exporters. So, in fact, you have 28 countries, but you have to you cannot count, sorry, you have to subtract, thank you, Alexis, to subtract Asian countries and manufacturing exporters. So, of course, if you subtract from the developing world Asian countries and manufacturing exporters, very probably you will find a lot of primary product exporters and no more manufacturing exporters. So there is a strong bias at the beginning. Secondly, his major argument is that the peak of manufacturing value added on GDP has reduced from 25% to less than 20. Okay, but in fact, and there are other studies on the structure of the world manufacturing industry, clearly show that the outsourcing trend, the outsourcing process in the manufacturing industry has led to fall of the apparent ratio of manufacturing value added on GDP because of the externalization of a number of activities, especially services activities that were formerly integrated into the manufacturing value added. Okay, when Renault or Fiat or General Motors outsource services activities, they move these activities, these value added, move outside from the manufacturing sector to the service sectors. And the trend is very strong everywhere. It's difficult to estimate on average, of course, but it's in the range of -5%. So roughly, the gap discovered by Rodwick is not far from the amount of new activities that has been outsourced during this 30 years period. And finally, there is also one point is that the frontier in terms of period for Rodwick is the 90s, or roughly before and after the expansion of China. Okay, after the 90s, it's a rise of China on the world market, both in terms of manufacturing production, but also in terms of imports of raw materials, with two major consequences. First, the rise of primary product prices, and then for the countries that were exporting primary product, the ratio of primary product export and GDP increased because of the volume, but also mainly because of the price increase. Okay, when oil, copper, nickel, and so on prices increase, but for countries such as Chile, Brazil, and so on, the ratio of the primary sector value added and GDP increase without any specific implication on the status of the manufacturing industry. Okay. And secondly, the rise of China as a world manufacturing product exporter also closed or narrowed the opportunities for other exporters. But it has been a specific stage or time period, which has no reason to last indefinitely. There is no reason that the very strong 30, 35, 40, 45 world market shares of China will last. Of course, China is the largest world exporter and world producer in manufacturing, and it will be roughly, it will keep this status during the century, very probably. But there is no reason to believe that this market share, Chinese market share, will stay the same, will remain as high. And in fact, they started already to decrease in a number of labor-intensive industries. You have a picture here, garments, footwear, and so on. China reached a peak roughly in the mid-2010s, and since then, these market shares have, the trend is decreasing. Now, if we look more at the data, and in fact, this paper and this research was made for the AFD, for the French Development Agency, in order to assess whether there are still growth potential in manufacturing for non-Asian countries. So we built, for this, we built a database on manufacturing activities in order to check whether the picture given by Roderick, the premature deindustrialization thesis, was right or not. And in fact, we found very well-known trend. So the decrease of the manufacturing value added in the north, so north and south, it's a very simple division. Let's say that north are OECD countries and south it's the rest of the world. Okay. So in the north, the share of manufacturing in GDP has decreased, while in the south, it's rather growing slowly. Okay. So far, there is no confirmation of the deindustrialization thesis. And if we look at the structure of the world manufacturing value added, so we have divided the south in two parts, almost the same share. China and the south minus China, okay, the rest of the south. Okay, so you have a three parts world: north, China, and south without China. Okay, and you can see that, of course, the Chinese rise has been impressive, nothing new, but in fact, the south has not, the south without China, the rest of the south, on average, has not declined so far, okay, in terms of value added. And in terms of employment, the share on average, so the world share, the world average, the share of manufacturing employment has not really changed. It's relatively stable. One job among 7 on average, still 30 years ago and now is in the manufacturing sector. But of course, the distribution of the jobs, of these jobs, has changed. Decline in the north, expansion in the south, with still the question, which share for China and the rest of the south. Okay? It's clear, or okay? And it becomes a little bit more interesting because in terms of structure, so decline in the north, growth in the south, but let's say a stronger or more solid growth of employment in the south than in China. In fact, when you estimate manufacturing employment in China, which is a little bit complicated because the data is not fully transparent, and you include the formal and the informal sector, because roughly at the world level, half of the manufacturing employment is informal, okay? So estimated. You can see that in China, since roughly 10 years, a little bit more than 10 years, in fact, manufacturing employment is stagnating, okay? It's stable and a little bit decreasing in some industry. While in the rest of the south, but of course it's an average, it's an aggregation, the growth goes on. And finally, if we look in terms of numbers, roughly you have 450 million jobs in the manufacturing sector in the world. Well, the share of the north decline, okay. No surprise, but you have a diverging since, well, recently, you have had, and before the COVID period, you have had diverging trends between China and the rest of the south. Okay. A continuous growth of manufacturing employment in the rest of the south, while the trend is so-so in China, but very probably declining, okay, decreasing. And of course, in terms of prospect, what is interesting is the most recent trend. So I move now to the case of Africa. So in fact, I will not answer this question. I will just draw a few consequence implication of what is happening now at the world industry level and the consequence especially of the Chinese industrial transition. Well, in your life and in your most recent period in the world economy, the major change has been the rise of China. Okay, from nothing in terms of exports, it was under 1% of world trade in the 70s, and a very fast expansion, becoming almost, depends how do you measure, the largest world economy, and at least the economy with the largest potential. But its restructuring process has started, and as I said, it's not fully transparent, as the data are not always very accurate. But however, the available solid information we have clearly show that there has been some transition, and it will continue, of course. And especially in the labor-intensive industries that were at the beginning, at the start of the Chinese expansion: garment, leather products, shoemaking, electronic assembly. Well, it's not here. In these industries, China is losing its competitiveness. For not including the trade conflict or the pressure, the protectionist pressure, without this trade policy aspects, at a more structural level, the wage level in China, the productivity level, the qualification and so on, has a major consequence that, in fact, in these industries based on low wages and mostly not so qualified worker or people with low qualification, the Chinese industry has lost, or is losing its competitiveness. And it has a major impact on the world economy, on world trade, because of the size of China. China has reached roughly 30% of world trade, and in this labor-intensive industry, it's often between 30% and 50% of the world market. Okay, so if you have a loss of competitiveness in these industries, as it has been the case before for Japan, for South Korea, for Southeast Asia, Thailand, Malaysia, and so on, that follow the same transition process, because for the same reason, wage increase and loss of competitiveness in labor-intensive industry. The major difference is the impact, is the size, okay? Because South Korea and Taiwan, when they were at the peak of their competitiveness on world trade, they reached together, well, less than 10% of the world market. While in the case of China, it's 3, 4, 5 times this share. But it's the same process. It's the same process for the same reason. The question is the speed at which, with which these producers in China will move abroad, or will completely lose their competitiveness, but not the trend. The major question is the speed. And it's the process is already quite advanced. It means that, in fact, the market share lost by China are won by other exporters. And roughly, there are half a dozen of new small manufacturing exporters that compensate for China. Bangladesh, Cambodia, Vietnam, Pakistan, Indonesia a little bit, depending on the product. Okay. But it's relatively concentrated. In fact, you have half a dozen Asian countries that benefit now, or that have benefited since the last 10 years from the loss of competitiveness of Chinese producers. Okay. This is the case of garment, and the average growth rate, annual growth rate during between 2015 and 2019. So Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia, and so on expand their export when China is exporting less, and the amount is not so big if you compare to Chinese export. But if you compare the loss of China market share, if you compare that to the size of this economy, it's quite impressive, in fact. Okay. The growth of the export, which has been very fast in a number of this relatively small economy, Bangladesh is not so small, but the other one that's not very big, has had a major impact on wages in this country. And this is the case of Cambodia, for instance. So you have the relationship between the volume of exports of garment, okay? They started to export garment in the early 2000s at a low level with very low wages, $50 a month, something like that, okay? And they expand the export relatively fast, and wages followed. It might not be high wages, right? Even at $200 or $250 a month, the life is not very comfortable in Cambodia. However, you have a strong relationship between export volumes, okay, and wages. Mainly because due to the size of this economy, which is small, the impact of these exports is huge on wages, okay? And the point is that, in fact, in this labor-intensive industry, such as garment or shoemaking, international buyers, they start to have difficulty to breathe when the wage reach roughly $300 a month. When they reach $300 a month, they start to look to other locations, cheaper. This has been the long story of Nike factories all around Asia, garment factories from Japan to South Korea to China and now to Cambodia, for instance. And of course, when you have a strong demand pressure that increase or push wages at higher level, which is quite a good result for the economy. At the same time, it reduces the competitiveness of these garment producers. Okay, and when you consider that China will be replaced sooner or later, maybe partly, by these small economies. In fact, the absorption capacity of these economies, of these countries, is much smaller than China. If you add Bangladesh plus Vietnam plus Cambodia plus Myanmar, if there is a stabilization in Myanmar, it's very small in comparison with China. So it means that, in fact, wage expansion will be relatively fast if the trend continue. And so this is not these are past figures, okay? It's realized, it's not a prospective estimation. But if we estimate a similar relationship for the other small manufacturing exporters, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and so on, in fact, and we consider that there will be a limit in terms of competitiveness, it means that they cannot grow as high as China in terms of market share, because when their export will continue to grow, wages will increase and they will reach a non-competitive level, meaning that export, production, and so on will stabilize in these countries, which is already the case in countries such as Vietnam, for instance. Vietnam is not far from the $300 limit. the major potential is in Bangladesh because of the size of the population, especially in the countryside. So there will be limits to the absorption capacity of this economy. And it means that roughly in the next 10 years, they will reach these limits, and it will reopen opportunities for a new generation of exporters if there are still available countries with lower wages than in Asia. Okay. And in these phases, if we estimate the potential in terms of export for these industries, it's roughly around 150, $200 billion in terms of export in the next 10 years. That will be out of reach of China, out of reach of the current, new exporters, and that will remain available for a new generation of exporters. In terms of jobs creation, it will amount to roughly 30 to 35 million of jobs in 2035. Of course, depending on the different trends, the speed of the Chinese decrease or fall, the absorption capacity of the new the small manufacturing exporters, such as Bangladesh or Cambodia. But even in the case of Cambodia, they are not far from this limit. So it's not so small. And the question, of course, will be where the international buyers, H&M and so on, will be able to find enough workers at lower wages than in Asia, for East Asia. Okay. In fact, there is not many direction. It will be in India or in Subsaharan Africa. It won't be in South America. Wages are too high. It won't be anymore in China or East Asia because the wages have increased. North Africa, well, thanks to some economic crisis, could compete, but roughly wages are also too high. The main labor supply, cheap labor supply, will be in India and China. In India and Sub-Saharan Africa. So the question is how this stock of job will be divided between these two locations. Here there are only two hypotheses. The African hegemony is a scenario in which African country or the African continent will take all the jobs, while the second hypothesis is a scenario in which the job creation will be divided equally between India and Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, but India, the prospect for India are not very, let's say, there is no reason to be optimistic, but because if you can see, this is the market share of India on the world garment market, with a very huge population, cheap population, and so on. India is not exporting at all, almost. Bon, of course, it could change. But so far, the made in India plan, Moody made in India plan, I don't know whether you have people from India here, is not very recent. The impact in terms of manufacturing export has been null so far. Of course, in the next 10 years, there could be a lot of changes. But still, there is a strong opportunity for African countries. to increase their activity in the manufacturing sector and to create jobs. Roughly 30, 35, 25, around 30 million jobs will move, possibly to Africa. But it won't be enough. It won't be enough because, as you may know, there will be a very huge increase of the working age population in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, the next decades. Roughly 700 million new workers are expected in Sub-Saharan Africa. So even if Africa is able to catch a significant share of these mobile jobs in labor-intensive industry, it won't solve the major problem of Africa, which is to create enough jobs for the young entrant on the labor market. But Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, is made of 50 and so on countries, and in fact, it's not as a whole continent that we should think, but more. It would be more relevant to consider the case of specific countries, and at a level of Senegal, Kenya, Madagascar, or Rwanda, this amount of job could change a lot of things. Okay, at the level of one or a small number of countries, not at the level of the continent. Voilà. I will stop at this point and let the comments flow.